chapter 89, part 2. And the dogs began to devour the sheep, and the wild boars and the foxes were devouring them, until the Lord of the sheep raised up a ram from among the sheep, which led them. And this ram began to butt and pursue with its horns, and it hurled itself against the foxes, and after them against the wild boars, and it ruined many wild boars, and after them it struck the dogs. And the sheep, whose eyes were open, saw the ram among the sheep, until it forsook its path, and began to butt those sheep, and trample upon them, and to walk where there was no path. And the Lord of the sheep sent this lamb to another lamb, to cause it to stand up to be a ram, in order to rule the sheep instead of the ram which had forsaken its way. And it went to it, and uttered with it secretly, alone, and raised it up to be a ram and chief, and to be a leader of the sheep. And during all these things, the dogs were oppressing the sheep. And the first ram pursued the second ram, and the second ram arose and fled from before it. Next, I watched the first ram until it fell before the dogs. And the second ram, after jumping up, led the sheep. And the sheep grew and multiplied, and all the dogs and foxes fled from it and feared it. And that ram butted and killed all the beasts, and the beasts no longer prevailed against the sheep, nor did they snatch anything at all away from them. And that ram begot many sheep, and it fell asleep. And a little sheep became ram in its stead, and it became ruler and leader of those sheep. And that house became large and broad, and a large and high tower was built upon that house for the Lord of the sheep. And that house was low, but the tower was raised up and was high. And the Lord of the sheep stood on that tower, and they spread a full table before him. And again, I saw that those sheep strayed, and went off in many paths, and abandoned that house of theirs. And the Lord of the sheep summoned some from among the sheep, and sent them to the sheep. And the sheep began to kill them. But one of them escaped safely, and was not killed. It sprang away and cried out over the sheep, and they wished to kill it. But the Lord of the sheep saved it from the hands of the flock, and brought it up to me, and made it dwell there. And he sent many other sheep to those sheep, to testify and lament over them. After that, I saw, when they abandoned the house of the Lord and his tower. They went astray entirely, and their eyes were blinded. And I saw that the Lord of the sheep wrought much slaughter upon them in their pastures, until those sheep invited that slaughter, and they betrayed his place. And he abandoned them into the hands of the lions, and the leopards, and the wolves, and the hyenas, and into the hands of the foxes, and to all the wild beasts. And those wild beasts began to tear those sheep in pieces. And I saw that he abandoned that house of theirs and their tower, and he threw them all into the hands of the lions, so that they might tear them in pieces and devour them, into the hands of all the wild beasts. And I began to cry out with all my might, and to call to the Lord of the sheep, and to show him concerning the sheep, because they were being devoured by all the wild beasts. But he was silent, though he saw it, and he rejoiced, because they were devoured and swallowed up and carried off. And he abandoned them into the hands of all the wild beasts as fodder. And he summoned 70 shepherds, and he left those sheep to them, that they might pasture them. And he spoke to the shepherds and their subordinates.
From this time forward, let each of you pasture the sheep, and do everything which I command you. I am handing them over to you duly numbered, and I will tell you which of them are to be destroyed. Destroy them.
And he handed those sheep over to them. And he summoned another one, and said to him,
Observe and mark everything which the shepherds do against these sheep, for they will destroy more from among them than I have commanded them. And every excess and destruction which is wrought by the shepherds, write down how many they destroy according to my command, and how many they destroy of their own volition. And every destruction by each individual shepherd, write down against them. And read it out before me by number, how many they destroy, and how many they hand over to destruction, so that I may have this testimony against them, in order that I may know every deed of the shepherds, so that I may measure them and see what they are doing, whether or not they are acting according to the command which I gave them. But do not let them know it, and do not show them or rebuke them, but write down every destruction by the shepherds, one by one, in his own time, and bring it all up to me.
And I watched until those shepherds were pasturing in their season. And they began to kill and destroy many more than they were bidden. And they abandoned those sheep into the hands of the lions. And the lions and leopards devoured and swallowed up the greater part of those sheep. And the wild boars devoured along with them. And they burnt down that tower and demolished that house. And I grieved exceedingly over that tower. And because that house of the sheep's had been demolished. And from then on, I was unable to see whether those sheeps were entering into that house. And the shepherds and their subordinates handed over those sheep to all the wild beasts to devour them. And at the appointed time, each of them individually was given over by number to his companion. It was written in a book how many of them he was destroying. And each of them killed and destroyed many more than was prescribed for them. And I began to weep and lament on account of those sheeps. And in the vision, I saw how that one who was writing wrote down each one which was being destroyed by those shepherds, day by day, and how he was bringing up and spreading out and showing that whole book to the Lord of the sheeps, everything which they had done, and everything which each one of them had made away with, and everything which they had handed over to destruction. And the book was read in the presence of the Lord of the sheeps. And he took the book from his hand, and read it, and set it down. And I watched until the shepherds were pasturing for 12 hours. And behold, 3 of those sheep returned, and came, and entered, and began to build all which had fallen down of that house. And the wild boars tried to hinder them, but they could not. And they began again to build as before. And they raised up that tower, and it was called the High Tower. And they began again to place a table before the tower, but all the bread on it was polluted and impure. And besides all these things, the eyes of the sheep were blind, and they did not see, and their shepherds likewise. And they were handed over to the shepherds for greater destruction, who trampled the sheep with their feet and devoured them. And the Lord of the sheep remained silent, until all of the sheep were scattered over the field and mated with them. And the shepherds did not save them from the hand of the beasts. And this one who was writing the book carried it up and showed it and read it in the houses of the Lord of the sheep. And he interceded with him on their behalf and petitioned him on their behalf, showing him all the deeds of the shepherds. And he testified in the presence against all the shepherds. And he took the book and set it down beside him and departed.